College football season has reached November, and November is the time where we finally get the answers and get the clarity we've been looking for about so many of the exciting stories in college football, and we'll finally figure out who is going to make the college football playoff. We'll learn what the committee thinks about these teams, and we'll learn just where the college football playoff picture is sitting and what it looks like. So in today's video, we're going to look at where things currently stand. What is the current state of the college football playoff race? So we'll go conference by conference and talk about the teams we need to talk about in terms of teams that are likely college football playoff teams, teams that are still eligible or at least on the fringe, and then teams that are out. Like with the ACC, Clemson, Miami, and SMU at this point are teams that I think people would consider to be likely college football playoff teams. Miami is still undefeated, SMU with only one loss on the season to BYU that ages better each day, and Clemson with only one loss to Georgia has dominated down the stretch here. Virginia Tech and Pitt are listed as the fringe. Now, some people might think both of these teams being in this tier is blasphemous for two different reasons. For Virginia Tech, it's because they have 3 losses, and for Pitt, it's because they're undefeated. Now, in Pitt's case, Pitt still has to play SMU this week, which they're underdogs against, and then they have to play Clemson a few weeks later. So it's a really tough stretch for Pitt football, and they're going to be dogs in both of those games. If they can pull those out, they'll definitely be upgraded a tier higher to a team that's actually considered to be a likely CFP team. But as things currently stand, they're a team that's projected to lose a couple games. But in Virginia Tech's case, they've lost 3 on the season, and yet they're somehow still alive in this playoff race because they only have 1 conference loss, and they get to host Clemson. So it's a really interesting story for Virginia Tech, a team that could totally be in the mix as well. They just have to win out and then win an ACC title, and they could get one of those automatic bids. It's a pretty interesting storyline to follow. Take a look at the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, you've got 4 likely CFP teams at this point. Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana. 4 teams, 3 of which are undefeated in Indiana, Oregon, and Penn State. Ohio State with the 1 loss by 1 point to Oregon. It's as close as it can get. Ohio State still has to play Indiana and Penn State down the stretch, but at this point, the way things are panning out, if somehow all of these teams end up with either 1 loss or undefeated, we're going to be looking at 4 Big Ten playoff teams at least. As far as fringe teams in the Big Ten, just because there's a scenario out there where something insane could happen, Nebraska and Illinois as teams that have 2 losses, like a 10-2 Big Ten team that is able to win some big games down the stretch, sure, I could see them being considered, but they're only really being put on there just to have the widest net possible, catching every single possibility. Next, we've got the Big 12. The Big 12 has 2 undefeated teams left, Iowa State and BYU, both teams that have looked really impressive down the stretch. BYU with some really insane wins, including one over Kansas State. That is definitely a playoff team in the making as well. They have that 1 loss to BYU, but have been cruising as of late and are a team that if they go 12-1 and win the Big 12, that's an auto bid in itself. Colorado and Arizona State, still a couple of teams that only have 2 conference losses that could have that backdoor push as well. So really, I'd say there's 5 teams in the picture in this really chaotic Big 12 right now. Of course, we have the SEC, which has been chaotic in its own right. There's no undefeated teams left in the SEC. Texas A&M is undefeated in conference play, so you can't not have them in this top tier here with Tennessee, who has a loss, Georgia, who has a loss, and Texas, who has a loss. And then you've got the fringe playoff teams, where we've got teams like Ole Miss, LSU, and Alabama with 2 losses, have been competitive, their resumes are still compelling. And I've even got a Florida team in there that has 3 losses. I just don't think they're technically eliminated at this point because of what they could theoretically, hypothetically do if they won out down the stretch here. Would a team with their schedule be denied? I don't think you can deny Florida in that case, but I know that's a little out there and not very likely at all, but you at least have to consider them, and that's why I have them in there. You cannot talk about the college football playoff race this season, however, without talking about the Group of 5. They get a spot, and they're guaranteed a spot, and the Group of 5 race is really simple. So let's just acknowledge it outright. You've got either Boise State making it. If they win out and win the Mountain West, they are the highest profile team with the best loss. That's right there. A 12-1 Boise State team, I think, trumps everyone. But if Boise State stumbles and they lose a game in conference play, then I think we're talking about whoever comes out of the American Conference. The odds, the way they're stacked right now, you'll either have an undefeated Army, a 2-loss Tulane that has 2 really good losses, a 1-loss Memphis, or a 1-loss Navy. If any of those teams can come out unscathed with those resumes I was talking about, even a 1-loss Army I think would be a good candidate. I think any of those teams would be in over a 2-loss Boise or any Mountain West champion that is produced. And if there's a case where they all just beat each other up and the resumes aren't really impressive, or in a case where like a 3-loss Tulane wins that conference, or a a 2-loss Army wins that conference, then I think we could be talking about Louisiana. Louisiana only has 1 loss in the season. It was to Tulane, so in the combination you're looking for, they probably need someone other than Tulane winning that they can be ranked over. But Louisiana is a team with a really compelling resume that's in a Sun Belt that I think is underrated, and I think the committee would probably consider Louisiana. So to me, that's what the Group of 5 race has boiled down to. So at this point in the Group of 5, the path of least resistance is Boise State being in the 12th seed. So let's plop them into our little playoff bracket here as the 12th seed, just the path of least resistance. I know Boise State in the Group of 5 champion, whoever it is, wouldn't be locked into the 12th seed, but that's just what's most likely. And we get to the Power 4 race. These are all the teams that were considered in those top couple of tiers that we went over earlier. So as you can see, the field has really shrunk of teams that can potentially make it. Let's start with the college football playoff long shots that I want to isolate. Teams where it's a really long shot. Where's the path? How does it happen? Well, we'll start with Florida. Florida, their long shot chance is that they have an insanely good strength of schedule. If they win out from here, they finish 9-3. They won't get the auto bid in the SEC, but they could get an at-large bid. You've got Colorado and Arizona State, who both, if they can win out at this point, they can land a Big 12 auto bid at 11-2 and win the thing. For Colorado, it's a little more likely because they only have the 1 Big 12 loss at this point. Arizona State, meanwhile, has 2. They're going to need a lot of chaos to happen with Iowa State, with BYU, with Kansas State in order for them to slip up in there. You've got Virginia Tech, who I went over a little bit earlier, but they would have to win out in ACC play, finish at 10-3 with 1 ACC loss, get into the ACC title game, and win that thing and get the ACC auto bid. That is the Hokies' path for Virginia Tech. And then you've got the 2 Big Ten teams that I touched on, Nebraska, Illinois. Again, I think these are 2 of the longest shots of teams that still have a chance, but in both cases, they could win out from here, go 10-2 and 7-2 in conference. For Nebraska, it would be with losses to Indiana and Ohio State. For Illinois, it would be losses to Penn State and Oregon. So both teams would have really strong losses and some really nice wins on their resume as well. So both would be in a position to get an at-large bid if one of them was able to win out. And so that's the reason those guys are all long shots. But I acknowledge those are all pretty far-fetched, pretty long shots. Colorado, I'd say maybe is the most likely out of there, but it's safe if we're talking about what the current picture is to take those teams out of the equation, simplify this, and that leaves us with these teams with the long shots being removed. Out of these teams, I think there's a fair amount that people would at this point consider to be a quote-unquote lock, or as close to a lock as possible. And I swear I'm not trying to jinx these teams, but these are the teams. I think Miami's a team where you look at their schedule, they're going to be favored in every game down the stretch. Clemson's a team that will also be favored in every game down the stretch and could make the ACC title game and play Miami. You've got a BYU team that is undefeated and will likely be either a close favorite or maybe a slight underdog in most of their remaining games in the Big 12, but have been winning as a slight underdog all season long. Texas A&M is undefeated in SEC play, and if they can pass a test at South Carolina this week, it is smooth sailing until that Texas game. And even if they lose that, they're going to be in the SEC title game, and I almost feel like the committee won't leave out a team that's in the SEC title game. Texas is a team that you look at their schedule, it's pretty manageable down the stretch here. Indiana, Oregon, Penn State also in that mix. Penn State's got that big test with the Buckeyes. Ditto with Indiana and the Ducks, a team that it looks like has a very clear path. I'm not saying any of these ones are slam dunks. I understand how the college football world works. But for now, just for argument's sake, path of least resistance, let's put those playoff quote-unquote locks into the bracket. Let's say Oregon wins the Big 10, BYU Big 12, Texas SEC, Miami ACC, and that's sort of what your playoff picture is starting to look like if you insert those teams in there accordingly. So that leaves us with the teams we left behind, which is essentially 11 teams fighting for just 3 playoff spots. And this is the type of stuff that gets me giddy as a college football fan. And even as a guy that was a denier of the 12-team playoff and didn't want it, this season has been the perfect season for a playoff like this, with all these teams that could be fighting for those spots. And I know some of you are screaming at your screen right now. You're like, what about Notre Dame? And another group of people are probably saying, what about Washington State? And I agree. Those are the 2 I would consider to be big-time wild cards in this situation, both with only a loss, both likely looking like they will win out to end the season. So in actuality, we could wind up with 13 teams fighting for just 3 spots if you break it down like this, and it's a really complicated thing that can actually be broken down pretty simply. There's the first group that I would just say win and you're in, and win games you're favored in and you're in, and I know there's other teams that technically have scenarios where they can do it, but To me, this tier is Ohio State and Notre Dame. Take care of your business and you will be in the college football playoff. Notre Dame, their strength of resume with that Texas A&M win is really helping them out. At 11-1, the Irish are in. If the Buckeyes win out from here, go 11-1, and maybe they play in the Big Ten title game, maybe they don't. It doesn't matter. They will be in as well. It's pretty simple for both those teams, and I think with the loss, Notre Dame and Ohio State are going to be really sketched out. The team, I think, may be just completely cooked in this case is Washington State. Washington State, unfortunately, has just not gotten some of the breaks they would have needed to have a resume compelling enough to make that playoff push. I do think they have a slightly underrated resume. They beat Texas Tech, they beat Washington, but both the Red Raiders and the Huskies have lost games down the stretch here that they just couldn't afford to have those teams lose, and then you've got the loss to Boise State. We'll see how the committee ends up treating Washington State's resume at this point, but I think they're cooked in terms of consideration with no conference title game, with a limit to how good their opponents can be. Oregon State not holding up their end of the bargain of being a good quality team on the schedule either. So Washington State may just be completely cooked. So we touched on it. Notre Dame and Ohio State. Washington State probably cooked. And we're left with a game of musical chairs, essentially. Pitt and SMU play this weekend. It's pretty much one or the other there. I think the winner of that game will have an opportunity. The loser will not. So it's literally a game of musical chairs there. You've got Iowa State and Kansas State that play each other at the end of the season. Once again, is the Big 12 going to get multiple teams in? It will probably go to the winner of this game. It's another big-time swing matchup, and that's provided that both these teams win out from there. But still a huge pivotal game. And then you've got Alabama and LSU who play, who they both have 2 losses. So once again, another huge swing game. One or the other, Bama or LSU, who will it be? And then we have sort of this 3-way action going on where Georgia plays Ole Miss and Tennessee, and it really feels like a round robin of those teams. Who's it going to be? In order for it to be Georgia, they'd have to beat Ole Miss and Tennessee. In order for it to be Tennessee, they just need to beat Georgia. In order for it to be Ole Miss, they have to beat Georgia. So it's a really crazy game when you look at it down the stretch. And let's just look at some of the scenarios. I think if Notre Dame cleans house, Georgia ends up winning both of those big games, LSU manages to beat Alabama, we're looking at a playoff picture like this. You've got Oregon, BYU, Texas, Miami with the byes. You've got all these matchups. LSU at Penn State, a really fun first-round matchup. Indiana in there, and we're stuck with the Big 12 somehow only getting one in. But what happens if we have an Ohio State backdoor Big 10 run? That puts them into the 1 seed, pushes Oregon down to the 5. We've got A&M sliding down a spot maybe, and that kind of chaos happening as well. But maybe there's an undefeated Iowa State play that ends up landing them into a high seed and something like that. And maybe we get a few more Big 12 teams into the picture as well. There are so many different combinations and permutations and scenarios that could come out of this college football playoff race. And hopefully this video was able to break it down to you in a way to where you understand what the stakes are and what the race is like at the tail end of the season. But that does it for this video, breaking down what the college football playoff picture looks like as we head into the final month of the season. It is super exciting football, and the month of November, if you're a college football contender, feels like the longest month of the season. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and let me know down in the comments, who do you think is going to be in the college football playoff this season, and how do you think things are going to pan out down the stretch?